In March 2013, the body of 21-year-old Samantha Caldwell was found inside her apartment at Oakwood Apartments in Atlanta, Georgia. The investigation that followed revealed a disturbing story of obsession, control, and violence. What began as an intense romance between Samantha and her younger fiancé, Matthew Reynolds, had unraveled into a dangerous cycle of possessiveness and jealousy. In December 2012, an engagement that should have been a celebration became the first step toward a tragic end. By March 5, 2013, a final confrontation would escalate beyond words, leading to a brutal act of violence that shocked an entire community. It was a quiet night in Atlanta, Georgia, the kind that made the city feel smaller than it really was. The streets outside the Oakwood Apartments were nearly empty, the occasional car passing by with headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside one of the apartment buildings, however, something horrific had just unfolded. At exactly 2:37 a.m. on March 6, 2013, a call came through to 911. The voice on the other end was male, young, and unsettlingly calm. There was something off about the way he spoke, as if he was barely holding himself together. His breaths were heavy, uneven, like he had just run a great distance. Yet he wasn't out of breath from running. He was out of breath from something else entirely. The dispatcher tried to get more details, the name of the victim, what had happened, whether there was still danger in the apartment. But the caller didn't say much, he only gave an address before the line went dead. Police units were already patrolling nearby, and within minutes, 2 Atlanta PD squad cars pulled up to Unit 4B of the apartment complex. The building was ordinary, the kind of place filled with students, young professionals, and couples starting their lives together. But what waited inside was something far from ordinary. When the officers knocked, there was no answer. The door, however, was unlocked, left slightly ajar. One of the officers hesitated before pushing it open, the faint creak of the hinges the only sound in the dimly lit hallway. What they saw inside froze them in place. The first thing that hit them was the smell, a mix of sweat, iron, and something even more distinct, something unmistakable, blood. A lot of it. The kitchen was the first thing visible from the doorway. It had once been spotless, the kind of space where someone had taken care to keep things neat. A bowl of fruit still sat on the counter. A dish towel hung from the oven handle. But everything else had changed. A fight had taken place here, and it hadn't been a small one. The refrigerator was smeared with dark red streaks, splattered as though something or someone had been slammed against it with force. Shattered glass from a broken plate was scattered across the tile floor, some pieces embedded in the skin of the lifeless woman lying beneath it. She was young, too young. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her head slumped against the base of the fridge, her long brown hair tangled and matted with blood. Her once beautiful face was nearly unrecognizable, swollen from blunt force trauma. A cut just below her cheekbone had bled onto her collarbone, the dried trail forming a pattern against her skin. Deep bruises covered her neck and arms, some newer than others, evidence of a struggle. One of her fingernails was broken completely off, as if she had fought desperately to claw her way out of the situation. And standing in the middle of it all, his hands covered in blood, was Matthew Reynolds. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shouting, he wasn't begging for forgiveness. He was just standing there, his gaze locked on the woman on the floor. His eyes had a distant emptiness, as if he had already left his own body, already accepted something that had not yet fully sunk in. He didn't resist when the officers approached. He didn't ask why they were there or what was happening. It was as if he had already made peace with the outcome before anyone else had even processed what had happened. His knuckles were raw, the skin on his right hand split open, evidence that he had hit something or someone too many times. The front of his white t-shirt was stained with streaks of crimson, but it was clear that none of it belonged to him. As the officers moved in, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the police radio and the slow drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the tile floor. It was clear that Samantha Sam Caldwell was gone. At 2:44 a.m., paramedics arrived, though they didn't rush. They already knew there was nothing they could do. One of them knelt beside the body, placing 2 fingers against her motionless throat. No pulse, no signs of life. Her body was already cooling. By 2:48 a.m., Matthew Reynolds was in handcuffs. He didn't ask questions, he didn't argue, he didn't deny anything. He simply followed the officers out of the apartment, his bare feet sticking slightly to the floor with every step. Neighbors had started to gather in the hallway, woken by the commotion. A young woman, still in her pajamas, covered her mouth with her hands when she caught a glimpse of the blood-soaked floor just inside the doorway. Another tenant, a middle-aged man, stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. He had heard shouting earlier that night but hadn't thought much of it. Arguments happened all the time in this complex. Nobody ever thought they would end in murder. As Matthew was escorted out, he looked up for the first time. His eyes scanned the crowd, but it was as if he wasn't really seeing them. His face was blank, drained of all emotion. He had the look of someone who had already accepted whatever was coming next. The police car door slammed shut. The last thing the neighbors saw was his expressionless face behind the window, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. By 3 a.m., the crime scene was fully secured. Investigators had started their work, marking blood spatter, photographing the kitchen, taking note of every single detail. But one thing was already clear. This wasn't just a fight, this wasn't just a moment of anger. This was a killing. And in the hours that followed, the truth behind what had happened inside Unit 4B would begin to unravel, revealing a story of love, obsession, betrayal, and uncontrollable rage. The interrogation room at the Atlanta Police Department was small and cold, the kind of space meant to strip people down to their most vulnerable state. The clock on the wall ticked past 8:15 a.m., but Matthew Reynolds sat motionless, staring at the scratched surface of the metal table in front of him. He had been there for over an hour, his hands cuffed, the dried blood on his skin starting to crack under the harsh fluorescent lights. Detectives Brian Foster and Elena Martinez watched him carefully. He wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't pleading, he wasn't angry. He simply sat there as if he had already accepted whatever came next. It wasn't the reaction they expected from an 18-year-old who had just beaten his fiancée to death. When they finally spoke to him, he responded in short sentences, his voice empty. He admitted what he had done, but there was no remorse, no emotion. He described the moment as if he had simply been a spectator watching his own actions unfold, as if the decision had been made long before his fists ever landed on Samantha's body. The confession was chilling, but the forensic team knew the crime scene told a much deeper story. By 9:30 a.m., forensic specialists had completed their preliminary analysis of Unit 4B. What they found suggested that Samantha had suffered more than a single outburst of rage. Her broken ribs indicated multiple blows to her torso. Her jaw was fractured, making it likely that she had been struck hard enough to knock her off her feet. Bruising along her throat suggested that someone had attempted to strangle her before delivering the final beating. The sheer force of the injuries told the detectives that this wasn't just a moment of uncontrollable anger. This was something else entirely. By 10:15 a.m., security footage from the Oakwood apartments was already being analyzed. The detectives expected to see Samantha arriving home alone earlier that night, but instead they saw something that changed the course of the investigation. At 12:15 a.m., just 2 hours before the 911 call, Ryan McAllister was caught on camera leaving Samantha's apartment. Detectives tracked him down at 11:50 a.m. He was sitting in a lecture hall at the Georgia Institute of Technology, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. When the officers pulled him aside, his face turned pale the moment they mentioned Samantha's name. His hands trembled slightly as he followed them into a separate room for questioning. By 12:20 p.m., he sat across from the detectives, his body tense. He wasn't a suspect, but his connection to Samantha made him an immediate person of interest. As they questioned him, he struggled to form coherent answers. It wasn't the kind of nervousness that came from guilt. It was the kind of fear that came from knowing something awful had happened and wondering if you were the reason for it. He admitted he had been at Samantha's apartment earlier that night. He had stayed for about an hour before she told him to leave. According to him, she was anxious, checking the time repeatedly, looking toward the door as if expecting someone. Then he used a word that the detectives would hear again and again over the next few days: possessive. It was a word that Samantha's friends had used in whispers. A word that had followed Matthew Reynolds since his teenage years. A word that hinted at a relationship that had never been as perfect as it seemed. As the investigation progressed, the detectives knew they had to go back to the beginning. The relationship between Matthew Reynolds and Samantha Caldwell had seemed picture perfect from the outside, but behind closed doors, it had always been something else entirely. By March 12, 2013, at 9 a.m., detectives sat down with those who had witnessed the relationship firsthand: friends, family, former classmates. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. The story of Matthew Reynolds didn't start on the night of the murder. It had started years before, shaped by a childhood that had taught him that love and violence could exist in the same space. His father had been a strict, controlling man. In their home, rules weren't just expected, they were enforced. Discipline meant harsh words, locked doors, and sometimes even worse. His mother had left when he was just 10 years old, and from that moment on, Matthew had learned that people who loved you could also hurt you, and that they could leave when they decided they'd had enough. At 16, he was already in court-ordered anger management classes after breaking another student's nose in the locker room after football practice. Coaches had said he had too much aggression. Teachers had said he was too intense, but girls had always seen something else in him, something magnetic, something dangerous, but exciting. And that was how Samantha Caldwell had first fallen for him. She was older, confident, and full of dreams. She was studying biochemistry with the goal of working in medical research. She had grown up in a stable home, surrounded by support and encouragement. She had never known what it felt like to be afraid of someone she loved. Until Matthew. When they first met, he was 17, just about to graduate high school. She was 21, finishing her junior year of college. The age gap wasn't huge, but the difference in life experience was. At first, she thought his obsession was devotion. She thought his jealousy meant he cared too much. She thought his constant calls, surprise visits, and possessive nature were just part of how he loved her. But as time passed, it became too much. Friends recalled moments that should have been warning signs. He would call her multiple times in a row if she didn't answer right away. He would show up unannounced at her college campus, demanding to know where she had been. He would watch her from across the room at parties, his expression unreadable. He would get irrationally angry whenever she mentioned a male classmate. And when she tried to pull away, he would threaten to hurt himself if she ever left him. But she stayed. Maybe out of love, maybe out of fear. Maybe because she believed she could change him. The engagement had been his idea. It happened in December 2012, just before Christmas. He had taken her to a small, dimly lit restaurant, presented her with a modest diamond ring, and asked her to promise forever. She had hesitated. It was small, barely noticeable, but people who knew her had seen it. Her smile that night had been forced, but in the end, she had said yes. Not because she wanted to, not because she was sure, but because she was afraid of what would happen if she said no. By March 2013, she was already pulling away. And by March 5th, 2013, just one day before she was killed, she had finally found the courage to tell him the truth. She didn't love him anymore. She wanted out. But she had underestimated just how dangerous it was to walk away from someone like Matthew Reynolds. And now she was gone. The night of March 5th, 2013, had started like so many before it. The sky over Atlanta was dark, and a steady drizzle misted the streets, making everything quiet, almost too still. Inside the Oakwood apartments, lights flickered behind curtains, each window hiding a different story. Inside Unit 4B, a tragedy was about to unfold, one that no one would stop in time. By 7:30 p.m., Matthew Reynolds had been on his way to Samantha's apartment, his heart beating in anticipation. He held a small bag of takeout in one hand and a bouquet of white roses in the other. He had picked them carefully. White roses, her favorite. He had spent the entire day thinking about her, about their future, about how, despite the small fights, the tension, the uncertainty, they were still meant to be together. But fate had other plans. When he pushed open the door, stepping into the place that had once felt like home, he saw something that made his entire world shift. Standing in the dimly lit kitchen, his presence as natural as if he belonged there, was Ryan McAllister. The moment Ryan saw Matthew, he froze, his entire body tensing. The air in the room changed in an instant. It was the kind of silence that only happened before something terrible. By 7:34 p.m., Ryan had left the apartment. The security cameras outside the building would later show him walking away quickly, his head down, his pace uneven. The footage would also show that he never looked back. Inside, the conversation between Samantha and Matthew had already begun to spiral. She hadn't denied anything, she hadn't rushed to explain, she hadn't tried to make him feel better. Instead, she had looked at him with tired eyes, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. By 7:40 p.m., the walls of Unit 4B had absorbed the weight of words that could never be taken back, words that would change everything. Matthew had stood there, frozen, his breath shallow, his hands tightening around the bouquet of roses until the delicate petals were crushed in his grip. He had spent so much time chasing her, worshipping her, loving her, and now she was telling him it had all been a lie. Then, in those next few seconds, something in Samantha's face had changed. The frustration that had built between them for months, maybe even years, had surfaced all at once. And then she made the one mistake that sealed her fate. At 7:41 p.m., something inside Matthew broke beyond repair. The first punch landed hard and fast, sending her stumbling backward, her shoulder slamming against the edge of the counter. A glass knocked over, shattering at her feet. But it wasn't over. By 7:42 p.m., the second blow had struck her face, splitting her lip open. The taste of blood filled her mouth, but she didn't back down. She fought back, her nails raking across his face, leaving scratches that would still be visible hours later. But he was stronger. He was relentless. By 7:43 p.m., she had tried to reach the door, but he grabbed her wrist and yanked her back. By 7:45 p.m., she had stopped fighting. By 7:46 p.m., she wasn't breathing. And by 7:47 p.m., the rage inside Matthew had finally faded into something else. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the steady drip of blood pooling onto the floor, soaking into the linoleum beneath her. His hands were shaking, his chest heaved, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had done this, he had done this.
By 7:50 p.m., the horror had set in.
He had dropped to his knees beside her, trying to wake her up. His hands moved to her cheek, her wrist, her throat, desperately searching for a pulse that wasn't there. By 7:55 p.m., he knew. And at 2:37 a.m., after spending hours in the same spot, staring at what he had done, he had finally reached for his phone. The call had lasted only 29 seconds. He had spoken slowly, too calmly, as if the reality of his actions hadn't yet caught up with him. And then, after giving the address, he had hung up without another word. The courtroom was packed by the time the trial began. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken tension. Spectators whispered among themselves, exchanging theories, dissecting every detail they had read in the news. The case had captured national attention, a dark tale of love turned into obsession, of betrayal met with uncontrollable rage. The press had gathered in full force, reporters lined the walls, their notebooks open, their cameras flashing at every opportunity. Every major network had sent correspondents, eager to document the proceedings of a trial that had become more than just a legal battle. It had become a reflection of something bigger, a conversation about domestic violence, about warning signs ignored, about the fatal cost of control disguised as love. Samantha's parents sat in the front row, their faces lined with grief, but their backs straight with quiet resolve. Linda Caldwell clutched a small framed photo of her daughter, a snapshot of a life that had been stolen. James Caldwell sat beside her, his hands folded tightly, his knuckles white. He had spent months preparing for this, but nothing could truly prepare a father to sit in a courtroom and listen to the brutal details of his daughter's final moments. And then there was Matthew, dressed in a grey suit that hung just slightly too loose on his frame. He sat at the defense table, staring straight ahead. He was thinner than he had been at the time of his arrest, his once boyish face now gaunt, his eyes hollow. He barely moved, barely acknowledged the weight of what was happening around him. It was almost as if he had already accepted whatever came next. By April 9th, 2013, Matthew's defense team had finalized their case. His attorney, Richard Holloway, was seasoned and sharp, known for taking on difficult cases with meticulous precision. He wasted no time painting Matthew as a victim of his own circumstances, a troubled young man shaped by a harsh upbringing, broken by a lifetime of instability. He was pushed too far, Holloway argued, his voice measured, controlled, a product of his environment, of years of emotional and psychological turmoil. This was not premeditated. This was not cold-blooded murder. This was a young man who reached a breaking point. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, but not everyone was convinced. The prosecution saw things differently. By April 12, 2013, the forensic team had presented their findings in full. The evidence spoke louder than any defense argument. The bruising patterns on Samantha's arms, defensive wounds, the multiple fractures, the blood spatter that indicated not just a moment of rage, but a prolonged and vicious attack. This was not an accident, the lead prosecutor, Rachel Kim, stated firmly. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was control. This was violence. This was murder.
The jury sat rigid in their seats as autopsy photos were displayed. Samantha's injuries were undeniable, the broken ribs, the strangulation marks, the bruises that indicated not just one night of violence, but a pattern, a history. There was no mistaking what had happened inside Unit 4B.
By April 18, 2013, psychiatrists had taken the stand to analyze Matthew's mental state. They dissected his past, his childhood in a volatile home, his issues with anger, his history of obsessive tendencies. But the prosecution countered every argument with one undeniable fact. No psychological explanation could justify what he had done. Matthew had options. He could have walked away. He could have left the apartment, stepped outside, cooled off, but he didn't. He chose violence. He chose to take a life. By June 10th, 2013, the jury had heard enough. 12 strangers, now bound by the weight of justice, had spent days reviewing evidence, analyzing testimonies, and deliberating over the fate of an 18-year-old who had once been seen as a love-struck fiancé. By June 12, 2013, at exactly 4:15 p.m., the verdict was delivered. Guilty, second-degree murder. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Samantha's mother clutched the frame of her daughter's photo even tighter, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. James Caldwell exhaled sharply, his shoulders shaking as he stared at the table in front of him. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Samantha back.
Matthew,
He barely reacted.
he didn't cry, he didn't plead. He simply stood, hands cuffed and shaking, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. And then, after a long silence, he finally spoke.
She shouldn't have laughed at me. The words sent a chill through the room. They weren't an apology. They weren't a plea for forgiveness. They were a statement, a justification in his own mind, a reminder of the twisted way he had seen love. By December 2013, Samantha Caldwell's family had turned their grief into action. They founded the Caldwell Initiative, a non-profit dedicated to educating young women about the warning signs of toxic relationships. What had started as a tragedy became a movement. Schools, colleges, and organizations across the country began incorporating their message into domestic violence awareness programs. By 2015, Samantha's name was spoken on college campuses, her story used as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. She had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of change, of resilience, of a future stolen too soon. Meanwhile, Matthew's story became something else entirely. By 2020, true crime documentaries dissected his descent into possessiveness and violence. Experts debated whether his rage had been instantaneous or inevitable. His past was analyzed, his actions scrutinized. He had become a case study, a lesson in how love, when twisted by obsession, could turn deadly. But for those who had truly known Samantha, it wasn't about debates or documentaries. It wasn't about analyzing what had driven Matthew to kill. It was about the life she should have lived, the dreams she should have chased, the future that had been stolen from her in a single night of rage. And for Matthew, it was about the 35 years he would spend behind bars, waking up every single day to the same truth. She was never coming back. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates. And check out another shocking case we've covered, the tragic story of a cheerleader beaten to death on Dream Honeymoon in Fiji. Be sure to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comments section.